What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our starts and sits for the wide receiver position for Week 7 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, moving into Thursday night football, we've got the Saints at Cardinals, and we kind of have issues with both of these receiving cores at the moment, so we're definitely going to need to watch the Saints receivers throughout the week and the Cardinals receivers throughout the week. But let's start with the Saints. Okay, at the moment, at the time I'm recording this, I should say, Chris Olave is not listed on the injury report approaching Week 7. And don't forget that this is a short week, obviously, with Thursday night football for these Saints receivers. But I do think if Chris Olave is good to go, you can't afford to sit. Chris Olave is showing far too much production, and the Cardinals haven't been playing great defensively whatsoever. So I like Olave in Week 7. Does not look like Michael Thomas is expected to be ready for Week 7. Unfortunately, the Michael Thomas curse is continuing. Jarvis Landry at the moment is also not expected to play. So I think Traquan Smith is worth a look in deeper leagues, especially full PPR leagues. If you are desperate for a flex option, he had 13.3 fantasy points in Week 6, 43 receiving yards off 3 receptions and a touchdown. But we should also keep an eye on Marquez Callaway, who had 6.6 fantasy points, 36 receiving yards off 3 receptions. Those are your next two receivers in line, behind hopefully a healthy Chris Olave. Like I said, if Olave is good to go, we are starting Olave in Week 7, but we're going to have to monitor these Saints receivers and their health moving into Week 7, although it looks like at the moment Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry won't be good to go in Week 7. All right, the Cardinals receivers took a really big hit. Guys, Hollywood Brown was just playing phenomenal football all season long. There's a strong possibility he's going to miss quite a few weeks, if not the rest of the season. But I have also read that Hollywood Brown is going to get a second opinion before he does sit out the remainder of the season with a serious ankle fracture. So we want to keep an eye on Hollywood Brown. I doubt he's playing regardless here in Week 7, especially with the short week. And due to the injury to Hollywood Brown, the Cardinals have traded for wide receiver Robbie Anderson. But listen, guys, I'm not going to come out here and start Robbie Anderson in Week 7. Let's see what happens. Let's sit back, see how he meshes into this offense. On top of that, DeAndre Hopkins is coming back for the Arizona Cardinals in Week 7, which is very positive. This is good news, right? He should line up against Marshawn Lattimore most of the night, but I do think that Hopkins is a receiver you can flex and have some confidence in Week 7. I like him more in Weeks 8, 9, and 10 against the Vikings, Seahawks, and Rams, but I know that we have bye weeks. I know that we have injuries. It's Week 7. I think that we can flex Hopkins over all, but I also think we can flex Rondale Moore, who's given us double-digit fantasy performances in his last 2 weeks, at least 8 targets for the young receiver in his last 2 performances. I think he's a strong flex overall. I hate to see Hollywood Brown getting injured. You guys know I've been a huge fan of him all season long. Was your wide receiver 5 before going down in Week 6. So we'll see what happens with Robbie Anderson. Overall, I think Hopkins is a decent flex, and I think Rondale Moore is a good flex as we move into Week 7. All right, Packers at Commanders, man. Allen Lazard is a start on a weekly basis. I don't care anymore, right? I mean, I've loved him week in and week out, but I was hesitant in Week 6, being that I thought he would see Sauce Gardner for a majority of the day. And I mean, Sauce Gardner played phenomenal against the Packers. But overall, Allen Lazard had 17.6 fantasy points. He tied his best performance on the season, 76 receiving yards and a touchdown. I mean, you're starting Allen Lazard on a weekly basis. There's no doubt about it. Romeo Doubs, on the other hand, has kind of come back to earth the last 2 weeks. He's really moved into that boom or bust category. So if you're absolutely desperate, you can flex him, but I just don't trust him. It's a pretty good matchup against the Commanders, but I think the majority of you guys, I'd rather you sit him because he's really disappointed us in the last 2 weeks. All right, so it looks like Carson Wentz is going to miss some time for the Commanders with a hand injury. So Taylor Heinicke is going to be rolling out there. Heinicke, not a bad backup quarterback by any means, and he's played with Terry McLaurin before, so I think you can flex McLaurin, but just don't expect a high ceiling. We haven't gotten one on the season. His best performance was surprisingly week 3 against the Philadelphia Eagles with 16.2 fantasy points, but I would just flex McLaurin and not expect more than 12 or 15 points at best out of McLaurin. Jahan Dotson may be back in week 7. We'll have to monitor his health throughout the week. I'm probably going to sit Curtis Samuel. I don't mind him as a flex, but after he had 2.6 points against Chicago, I'm just a little wary here. I mean, similar to Romeo Doubs, like Curtis Samuel's kind of in that boomer bust category on a weekly basis. If you absolutely have to flex him, you can, but you just have to be aware that he may not give you a very good stat line, or he might give you a good stat line. It's just a frustrating player on a weekly basis. I would say for a majority of you guys, I'm going to sit Curtis Samuel as we move into week 7. All right, Browns at Ravens, man. Amari Cooper's moved up to your wide receiver 10 on the season. After he had the awful performance in week 4, he's really come back and proven himself against the Chargers in week 5, 20.6 fantasy points, and against New England in week 6, 14.4 fantasy points, 44 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He has 4 touchdowns through 6 games so far on the season, and Baltimore is definitely a defense that gives us these game scripts from a fantasy perspective where we see starters score points. So I like Amari Cooper moving into week 7. He should be in your starting lineups. Donovan Peoples-Jones has given us 2 double-digit fantasy performances in his last 3 games and a 9-point performance in the middle of those 2 double-digit fantasy performances. So I think if you're absolutely desperate, you could flex DPJ, but I got an asterisk here because I don't love it. I mean, he's, we talked about Curtis Samuel or Romeo Doubs being boomer bust. DPJ is your definition of a boomer bust player on a weekly basis. This is really for deeper leagues. If you're absolutely desperate, like I said, the Ravens are allowing really good game scripts overall to wide receivers. So I think you can roll with DPJ in deeper leagues if you need to. But like I said, for a majority of you guys, I'm going to sit him as we approach week 7. All right, Devin Duvernay lined up as your wide receiver 1 for the Ravens in week 6 and did absolutely nothing. After having 12.8 fantasy points in week 5 as the wide receiver 1, in week 6 he had just 2.4 fantasy points. So we need to keep an eye on Rashad Bateman, who John Harbaugh has said is close to a return, but even in his last 2 starts, he had no more than 4.9 fantasy points. So I don't hate the matchup here, but I'm just not really confident in throwing Duvernay or Bateman into our starting lineups. Let's wait and get a consistent pattern out of one of the 2 receivers before we're throwing them into our starting lineups. All right, Buccaneers at Panthers. I'm starting Mike Evans on a weekly basis. Didn't have a good game in week 6. I mean, really, Pittsburgh has been the worst team against opposing receivers as we headed into week 6 on the season. And Mike Evans only had 4 targets, 4 receptions, 42 receiving yards. It made no sense. 8.2 fantasy points, but we can't afford to sit Mike Evans. The ceiling is too high. He's still in your starting lineups. Chris Godwin had the better day out of the 2, 12 targets, 6 receptions, 95 receiving yards, 15.5 fantasy points in full PPR. Once again, you are starting Chris Godwin on a weekly basis. Julio Jones was inactive in week 6. I don't think he is a player we are considering as we approach week 7. Russell Gage is still seeing a little bit of work, but not enough to consider him a starter. So really, it's just Mike Evans and Chris Godwin as we approach week 7 for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiving core. I'm going to sit the Panthers receivers. I mean, the only Carolina Panther that I'm going to start with any confidence is Christian McCaffrey when it comes to fantasy football. 3.7 points against the Rams, who have played awful in terms of a secondary in week 6. Just 3 receptions for 7 receiving yards. We know that Robbie Anderson, as we discussed, has been traded to the Cardinals. We can keep an eye on Higgins or Chenault here, but neither of them have done anything on the season. Neither has Terrace Marshall, and I just think that this is a bad situation for DJ Moore, because when you look at this Panthers offense outside of CMC, when you look at the receivers and the tight ends, like, it's going to be really easy to just X out DJ Moore. I really think this Panthers team is essentially in shambles as we approach week 7, so I don't want to start DJ Moore or any of their receivers. All right, Falcons at Bengals. I'll sit Drake London. I mean, single-digit fantasy performances in his last 3 weeks. I just don't have any confidence here, guys. I really don't. If you're absolutely desperate, I guess you could flex him because of what we saw in the first 3 weeks on the season, between 12.4 and 24.6 points in those first 3 weeks. But we just haven't seen it, and this offense hasn't looked great, although they played very well in week 6 and got the victory. I'm still a little wary of Marcus Mariota coming off of his best fantasy performance at the quarterback position. He's still been very up and down in terms of throwing the football throughout the season. Just 3 receptions, 40 receiving yards for Drake London in week 6. I'm not a huge fan as we approach week 7. I'd love to see him get back on track, though. All right, the Bengals receivers. Told you guys, please try and trade for Jamar Chase. Well, there's still non-confidence throughout the fantasy community. Maybe not all the fantasy community, but certain members of the fantasy community. Please try and trade for Jamar Chase while you can, because as soon as he hits one of those high ceilings that we saw last year, you're not going to be able to trade for him. Again, 32.2 points in week 6, his best fantasy day of the year against the New Orleans Saints. 7 receptions, 132 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. This is why we start Jamar Chase on a weekly basis. He moved up to wide receiver 6. You just can't afford to sit him. These ceilings are far too high. All right, wasn't necessarily sure if we were confident in trusting T. Higgins in week 6 after the debacle that we had in week 5, where he was listed as healthy but wasn't really healthy and then was just benched. Just amazing mind games by the Bengals coaching staff. But anyways, T. Higgins is a flex on a weekly basis. Still brings a nice ceiling. You know, his best performance on this season is 25.4 points. In week 6, he had just 10.7 points in full PPR, but still a double-digit fantasy performance. 6 receptions, 47 receiving yards. All right, with the injuries that have been popping up and with the bye weeks out there, do you think you can consider flexing Tyler Boyd? The Falcons secondary has not played phenomenal on the season. Boyd coming off of a double-digit fantasy performance in week 6, 12.6 fantasy points, 6 targets, 6 receptions, 66 receiving yards overall. Tyler Boyd in full PPR is always a name you can consider, but he does carry some boomer bust potential, not the craziest ceilings as well. Tyler Boyd is always a player at the end of the day that you can consider, but like I said, you just got to be wary that he might not bring you the highest ceiling. So for those of you guys in deeper leagues, as long as it's full PPR, do you think you can consider flexing Tyler Boyd as we approach week 7? All right, moving on to the Lions and Cowboys. I'm starting AMON-RA St. Brown, especially in the flex. I know he didn't look great in week 5, but I don't think he was necessarily fully healthy. We were kind of worried about starting him against New England, but overall, even with missing week 4, he's still a top 20 receiver on the season. I think he'll be fully healthy, good to go after the bye week in week 6. A little bit of a tough matchup, but we saw the Eagles receivers play really well in week 6. So I still have faith in AMON-RA St. Brown being a high ceiling player on a weekly basis. Not sure if DJ Chark's going to be good to go in week 7. He is not my favorite option as we approach the week. I much rather would start Josh Reynolds in the flex. He was giving us double-digit fantasy performances in 4 out of his 5 games on the season. I really believe in him in full PPR. Maybe not the craziest ceilings involved for Josh Reynolds, especially with AMON-RA coming back and potentially DJ Chark coming back, but I still think Reynolds is a good weekly option in full PPR. Looking at the Cowboys receivers, he continued to start CeeDee Lamb. He played just fine without Dak Prescott. He got you double-digit fantasy performances every week. With Cooper Rush at quarterback, he should only improve with Dak Prescott's return, and this Lions defense has played absolutely atrocious. So we're starting CeeDee Lamb with confidence, but we want to keep an eye on Michael Gallup as well as Noah Brown, who should gain some value overall with the return of Dak Prescott, especially Michael Gallup, who has a proven chemistry with Prescott. So monitor them heading into the week. If they're available in your league, which, you know, Noah Brown probably is sitting at 15% rostered, but Michael Gallup's 62% rostered. If they're available, keep an eye on them. They might be players that you can make a move for as we approach week 7. Right, Giants at Jaguars. I think we watched Randall Robinson, who looked like the wide receiver 1 for the Giants. I mean, only 4 targets here, 3 receptions, 37 receiving yards, and a score in week 6. But like I said, that's enough to make you look like the wide receiver 1 for the Giants. 12.7 fantasy points. We probably want to keep an eye on Darius Slayton as well, but he came back to earth in week 6 after performing well in week 5. I mean, there's just not a lot of consistency here with this receiving core, but I do think there's definitely a possibility that Robinson is the wide receiver 1 moving forward. So we need to keep an eye on him moving into week 7. All right, Christian Kirk is a flex for me at this point. Single-digit fantasy performances in weeks 4 and 5, although those were just bad offensive performances overall by the Jaguars. Not a great performance offensively in week 6 against the Colts, but a much improved performance in comparison to the last 2 weeks. And Christian Kirk had 10.8 fantasy points, 4 receptions, 24 receiving yards, and salvaged his fantasy stat line with a score. So he moves down to flex for me, but I'm not ready to give up on Christian Kirk just yet as we approach week 7. All right, Colts at Titans. The Titans have not played well against opposing receivers. I like Michael Pittman. I liked him going into week 6, and he definitely had a good fantasy performance. 26.4 fantasy points, 13 receptions, 134 receiving yards. A really nice day, especially in full PPR scoring formats. He's a top 15 receiver on the season, so I think we continue to roll with him against the Titans in week 7. It is worth mentioning his worst fantasy performance on the year was week 4 against the Titans, but I do think he is a solid enough start as we approach the week. Alec Pierce is my freaking guy, man. I've been telling you guys the last 2 or 3 weeks, please pick up Alec Pierce, especially in full PPR scoring formats. He had 13.9 fantasy points in week 6, 3 receptions off 7 targets, 49 receiving yards, and his first touchdown of the season. I really like Alec Pierce as we approach week 7. I think Bobby Trees is going to be a sit for me for the Tennessee Titans. I mean, so far on the season, we have 2 double-digit fantasy performances, and outside of that, 7.9 or less points in his other 3 matchups. I just don't feel confident enough moving forward with Bobby Trees, and there's no other receiver worth mentioning other than Robert Woods for the Tennessee Titans. So I think we sit Robert Woods as we move in to week 7. All right, Texans at Raiders. I think we sit Brandon Cooks. Like, I just don't have the confidence here. If you absolutely need to flex him, it's okay. He's got 3 single-digit fantasy performances on the season, an 18.7 performance in week 4, and a 15.2 performance in week 1. I will say the Raiders haven't played very well against opposing receivers, but I just don't love Brandon Cooks. I just don't have a lot of confidence in this offense outside of Dameon Pierce. So I think for a majority of you guys, we're going to sit Brandon Cooks as we approach week 7. Davante Adams is a start on a weekly basis. Your wide receiver 8 in full PPR scoring formats, 27.4 fantasy points in week 5 before having the bye week in week 6. This was his second best fantasy day on the season. 2 touchdowns, 124 receiving yards. He did it off 3 receptions. I mean, we just start Davante Adams on a weekly basis. There's no doubt about it. Doesn't look like there's going to be any legal issues affecting him at the moment with the incident that happened after the Raiders loss in week 5. Hunter Renfrow, I don't have any confidence in starting. No more than 8.9 fantasy points so far on this season. I would love to see him get back to what we saw him do last year, but we haven't seen it this year, so I'm not starting Hunter Renfrow, and I'm not starting Mac Hollins, who did absolutely nothing off 4 targets in week 5 and really hasn't done anything since that 29.9 performance in week 3. There's no consistency there. I'm not starting any Raiders receivers outside of Davante Adams. All right, Jets at Broncos. I'm sitting the Jets receivers, man. This Broncos defense, which at the time I'm recording this, they haven't played their Monday night game yet, but they will still probably be at least in the top 5 against opposing receivers on the season. This Broncos defense is for real. And on top of that, when we look at the Jets receivers right now, there's just nobody we can trust. In week 6, we had 4 targets to Corey Davis, 5 targets to Garrett Wilson, and 0 targets to Elijah Moore. I mean, Braxton Berrios looked like the best receiver out there, but he's not even scoring through the passing game. He's scoring on the ground. So I just don't know what to do with this Jets receiving room. I didn't want you guys starting any of them in week 6. I mean, maybe in deep enough leagues, he could take an absolute dart throw at Braxton Berrios, but I really just don't have the confidence in this Jets receiving room. The Jets are getting it done through the run game and through their defense as well. Looking at the Broncos receivers, like I said, the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played, so I don't know what's going to happen tonight, but Courtland Sutton has been a start on a weekly basis for us. Not a crazy high ceiling involved for Sutton, but he's been extremely consistent, double-digit fantasy performances in every game through week 5 of the season. His highest performance was 19.7 points. His lowest was 11.2. So I think we start Sutton on a weekly basis. He's just a safe start unless you have better options. Jerry Jeudy is a flex for me, but we might, well, you know, we might want to see what happens Monday Night Football. So we got an asterisk here, right? He's a boomer bust flex at the end of the day. So if you don't have better options, I do think you can roll with Jerry Jeudy, but the Jets defense is playing well right now, and Sauce Gardner will be on probably both these receivers at different points throughout the game. So I do think their upside is limited, but like I said, depending on how Monday Night Football goes, we might want to take a chance on Jerry Jeudy if you absolutely have to in the flex position, because I know some injuries have popped up and we have a couple teams on bye week as we approach week 7. All right, Chiefs at Niners. Man, we finally got some good performances from a fantasy perspective out of the Chiefs receiving room. McCole Hardman found the end zone. Juju Smith-Schuster went wild, found the end zone. 113 receiving yards for Juju, 22.3 fantasy points. And we saw a lot of production actually out of Hardman and Juju, but I think a lot of that had to do with the game script overall. MVS continues to be essentially irrelevant, just far too inconsistent from a fantasy perspective, and Sky Moore has done essentially nothing on the season. He's your wide receiver 117. So yeah, Hardman had a good performance, Juju had a good performance, but I'm sitting them. I don't like this game script against the Niners. It's not going to be the same type of game script that we saw against the Bills, and even against the Bills, I wasn't confident in starting Juju or McCole Hardman. So if you're absolutely desperate, if you need to flex one of the two, maybe I like Juju more. I don't know. I'm still not confident in this Chiefs receiving room from a pure fantasy perspective as we head into week 7. Deebo Samuel's a start on a weekly basis. Another week for Deebo, another double-digit fantasy performance. He is your wide receiver 11 in full PPR. There's no question about it. You are starting Deebo. All right, Brandon AIYUK. Doing Brandon AIYUK things, right? Giving us 2 single-digit fantasy performances, taking our confidence away in weeks 4 and 5, and then having 28.3 fantasy points against Atlanta in week 6. 2 scores for AIYUK, 83 receiving yards, 8 receptions. I mean, yeah, listen, I think you can flex AIYUK, but be prepared to be disappointed. This Chiefs secondary hasn't played very good against opposing receivers, so I think you can throw a dart at AIYUK, but like I said, just be prepared to be disappointed. I don't think you're going to get 28 points again. Hopefully, we get back to seeing more consistency and see him get, you know, between 11 and 12.9 points like he did in weeks 2 through 3. But I have to emphasize, if you start AIYUK in the flex position, prepare to be disappointed as we head into week 7. All right, Seahawks at Chargers. This is a good game script. Overall, this should be a good day from a fantasy perspective for both of these offenses. But DK Metcalf had a bad week in week 6 against the Arizona Cardinals, and so did Tyler Lockett. Both these receivers were on absolute fire in the previous weeks, but they came back to earth in week 6 against the Arizona Cardinals. With all that being said, I think we still start Metcalf and Lockett as we head into the week. They are great wide receiver 2s or flex options for your roster moving into week 7 overall. I think we continue to roll with Mike Williams as well. Don't exactly know how Monday Night Football is going to go for him. Probably lining up against Pat Surtain with Keenan Allen not playing in week 6. But hey, Mike Williams has given us far too good of ceilings to consider sitting him. He's a great wide receiver too. He's a great flex. I mean, really from a fantasy perspective, I think the Seahawks and the Chargers wide receivers resemble a lot of the same value. But with that being said, let's keep an eye on Keenan Allen throughout the week. There's a possibility that his return will be in week 7 against Seattle, and this would be a good game script, a good matchup to start Keenan Allen. But if you want to give it a week or so, you know, he does have a bye week in week 8. So if you want to kind of give it a week in week 7 to see how he performs, he might be better off on your bench. I mean, you haven't been starting him anyway, so unless you're absolutely desperate, I don't think you need to start him in week 7. I think after week 8, you know, there's a possibility he doesn't play in week 7 and he just rests through week 8 to make sure he's 100% and good to go. I do think Keenan Allen's going to get back to true form, but at the moment, the upside lies with Mike Williams. So he's a receiver to start as we approach week 7 for the Chargers. All right, Steelers at Dolphins. I'm sitting the Steelers receivers, guys. I mean, I really thought Pickens could give us some nice upside in week 6. I really thought that the Steelers would be playing, you know, purely from behind and being forced to throw the football a lot more than they did. And, you know, I mean, Deontay Johnson had 7 targets. Pickens had 6 targets, right? Like, they still had to throw the football. I mean, Chase Claypool had 7 targets as well, and Chase Claypool had the best fantasy performance. I mean, you know, scored the touchdown, ended up winning this game for the Steelers. 23.4 fantasy points on the day for Claypool. You know, he's actually starting to trend in the right direction, but even Deontay Johnson and Pickens had double-digit fantasy performances in week 5, as did Claypool. So it's like, I just don't know what to do with this receiving room, guys. Like, you can flex any of the 3 players if you really want to or you really have to, but I just don't see a lot of consistency out of the Steelers receiving room. So I think they're better off on your bench unless you're absolutely desperate. All right, I was a little bit worried about the Dolphins receivers in week 7 with Skylar Thompson rolling out at quarterback, but he had to exit the game with an injury, and Teddy Bridgewater came in and played, and Bridgewater actually played pretty decently, but I was really worried early in the week about Jalen Waddle's production, which I got some heat for overall, and he did just fine. 16.9 fantasy points for Waddle, 129 receiving yards off of 6 receptions, and Tyreek Hill, on the other hand, had his best fantasy performance of the whole season. 29.7 fantasy points, 177 receiving yards, and 12 receptions. So the Steelers secondary is awful. Does not look like we're going to have issues at the quarterback position, at least from a fantasy perspective. It's going to affect Waddle or Hill and their overall production. So I think moving into week 7, we continue to start Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Bears at Patriots. I think you can flex Darnell Mooney only if you're absolutely desperate enough and only if you play in full PPR. I actually liked him going into week 6. For those of you who owned him in full PPR scoring formats as a flex, and he got you 13.8 fantasy points, 68 receiving yards, and 7 receptions. I have to emphasize here, this is really only on here as a flex option because some injuries popping up to wide receivers and because of the couple of bye weeks. So I don't love Darnell Mooney this week. I think that the New England Patriots defense is going to play very well in this game, but the opportunities and the targets should be there for Mooney to where he can give you at least a semi-respectable fantasy stat line as we head into week 7. Jacoby Myers, on the other hand, kind of disappointed in week 6 against Cleveland, but he still got you 10 fantasy points in full PPR, 60 receiving yards off of 4 receptions. So in every game that Myers has played in full PPR scoring formats, he's given us double-digit fantasy performances. But his ceiling is a little bit too inconsistent for me to really want to encourage him as a starter on your team. So I like him in the flex. Don't get me wrong. I do think he's a good flex. I do think this is a good matchup. But I wouldn't consider Myers anything more than a flex. Hopefully he gets you a higher ceiling like we saw in week 5 or week 2 where he had between 18 and 24 fantasy points. Overall, both these receivers, the Bears and Patriots matchup, will be flexes for me. And I'm not really considering any other receivers on either team as we head into week 7. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. Make sure to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.